Intro. Close your eyes for a moment. It's the autumn of 1347. In the port city of Messina, Sicily, a fleet of ships has just arrived from the Black Sea. The dockworkers who go to meet them find most of the sailors already dead. The ones still alive are covered in black swellings the size of apples, oozing blood and pus from their armpits and their groins. The port authorities order the ships out of the harbor immediately. It's already too late. What those ships carried would kill between 30 and 60% of every human being in Europe over the next 5 years. It would empty cities, collapse economies, end dynasties, and fundamentally alter the course of Western civilization. They called it the Great Mortality. History calls it the Black Death. And in the middle of the worst pandemic the medieval world had ever seen, one kingdom made a decision so extreme, so ruthless, so perfectly calculated that it worked. This is the story of the kingdom that survived. Get comfortable. This one stays with you. Chapter 1. The Plague Arrives. The Black Death began somewhere in Central Asia, probably in the 1330s or 1340s. It traveled along the Silk Road, the great trading network that connected China to the Mediterranean, carried by fleas living on rats that moved with merchant caravans and ships. The bacterium responsible, Yersinia pestis, had 3 ways to kill you. Bubonic plague attacked the lymph nodes, creating the characteristic swellings, the buboes, that gave the disease its name. Septicemic plague entered the bloodstream directly, causing internal bleeding and blackening of the skin. Pneumonic plague infected the lungs and could be spread by breath alone. Bubonic plague killed roughly 30 to 60% of those it infected. Pneumonic plague killed close to 100%. By 1346, it had reached the Crimea. By 1347, it was in Sicily, Marseille, Genoa. By 1348, it had spread across France, Spain, and into England. By 1349, it was burning through Germany, Scandinavia, and Eastern Europe. It moved at the speed of trade, along every road, every river, every coastline that connected medieval Europe. Contemporary chroniclers described towns where the dead outnumbered the living, where gravediggers themselves died before they could finish their work, where priests refused to administer last rites because approaching the dying meant dying themselves, where entire villages simply went silent. One Florentine writer described seeing dead bodies in the streets treated with less concern than dead goats. In some regions of Europe, half the population was gone within 2 years, and the disease was still moving. Chapter 2. What the plague did to kingdoms. The Black Death didn't just kill people, it destroyed systems. Governments collapsed when their administrators died. Courts stopped functioning because judges and clerks were gone. Armies dissolved when soldiers fell sick faster than they could be replaced. The church, the most powerful institution in medieval Europe, suffered perhaps the most visible crisis. Priests died in enormous numbers because their vocation required them to be near the dying. Bishops, abbots, and parish clergy fell across the continent. Entire monasteries were wiped out, and as the church's representatives died, people began asking a question that the medieval world was not equipped to answer. If God was all-powerful, and the church spoke for God, why was God allowing this? Some turned to flagellants, groups of men who whipped themselves publicly in penance, marching from town to town, believing the plague was divine punishment for human sin and that extreme suffering might buy mercy. The church eventually condemned the flagellant movement, but not before it had spread across Germany and the Low Countries. Others turned to violence. Jews across Europe were accused of poisoning wells and causing the plague. Entire Jewish communities were massacred in Strasbourg, in Mainz, in dozens of other cities, by mobs who needed someone to blame for a catastrophe they couldn't understand. The Pope himself, Clement VI, issued formal proclamations defending the Jews and pointing out they were dying from the plague at the same rate as everyone else. The massacres continued anyway. Economies fractured. With half the labor force dead, the surviving peasants discovered something that would reshape European society for centuries. They were suddenly valuable. Land was abundant. Workers were scarce. For the first time in the medieval period, peasants could demand better wages, better conditions, and the freedom to move. The feudal system, which had organized European society for 400 years, began to crack under the weight of the dead. And in the middle of all this, one kingdom watched what was happening across Europe and made a decision. The Kingdom of Poland, Copy, in 1347, as the plague was burning through Sicily and southern France, the Kingdom of Poland was ruled by Casimir III. The king history would later call Casimir the Great. Casimir was not a warrior king in the traditional medieval sense. He was an administrator, a builder, a man obsessed with law, infrastructure, and the practical machinery of governance. He had spent his reign building roads, fortifying cities, reforming the legal code, founding universities, and expanding trade. Poland under Casimir was one of the most organized kingdoms in Central Europe, and when reports began arriving from the West, from merchants, from diplomats, from refugees, about what the plague was doing to France, to Italy, to the Holy Roman Empire, Casimir did something almost no other medieval ruler thought to do. He started preparing before it arrived. He didn't know what caused the plague. Nobody did. The germ theory of disease wouldn't exist for another 500 years. But he observed, from the reports coming in, that the plague seemed to travel with people, along trade routes, through ports, following the movement of merchants and travelers, and he made a decision that was, for a medieval king, almost unthinkable. He began restricting movement. Travelers arriving from plague-affected regions were stopped at borders. Trade with infected areas was reduced or halted. Movement between Polish towns was regulated. People showing signs of illness were isolated, not perfectly, not scientifically, but systematically, in a way that no other kingdom in Europe was attempting at the same scale. He also took an extraordinary step regarding one of the most persecuted groups in Europe:
the protection of the Jews. As Jewish massacres spread across Germany and Western Europe, driven by the accusation that Jews had caused the plague by poisoning wells, Casimir issued a series of formal royal decrees. Any person who killed a Jew in Poland would face the full force of royal law. Jewish communities would be protected by the crown. The accusations of well poisoning were, his decrees stated, false. The reasons behind Casimir's protection of Poland's Jewish community have been debated by historians for centuries. Some point to a practical economic motive. Jewish merchants and financiers were essential to Poland's commercial infrastructure, and losing them would damage the kingdom's economy. Some point to personal relationships. Casimir was rumored to have a Jewish mistress named Estera, though historians dispute the details of this story. Some simply credit him with a degree of rationality and justice unusual for his time. Whatever the reason, the result was significant. While Jewish communities across Germany and France were being burned and massacred, Poland's Jewish population was largely protected. Jews fleeing persecution in Western Europe began moving east into Poland, where the crown offered at least a degree of legal protection. Poland became, over the following decades and centuries, home to one of the largest Jewish populations in the world, a demographic shift that traces its origins directly to Casimir's decrees during the Black Death. And the practical consequence, largely unrecognized at the time, was that Poland retained the merchants, traders, and skilled professionals that other kingdoms were massacring, preserving economic and intellectual capacity that would matter enormously in the years that followed. The plague reaches Poland. Casimir's precautions did not stop the plague entirely. That was never possible. The medieval world didn't have the tools, the knowledge, or the infrastructure for a true cordon sanitaire, a complete barrier against a disease that travelled invisibly, in fleas, in breath, in the simple act of human contact. The Black Death reached Poland in 1348 and 1349, but it behaved differently there than it did in France, in Italy, in England. The death toll in Western Europe ranged from 30 to 60% of the population in most affected regions. Some cities, Florence, Hamburg, parts of Normandy, lost more than half their inhabitants within 2 years. Poland's death toll, by the estimates of modern historians, was significantly lower. Somewhere in the range of a quarter of the population, devastating by any ordinary measure, but dramatically less catastrophic than what was happening to Poland's neighbours. The reasons are still debated. Some historians emphasize Casimir's movement restrictions. Some point to Poland's lower population density compared to the crowded cities of Italy and France. Fewer people in closer contact meant slower spread. Some note that Poland's trade connections to the most infected regions were less extensive than those of port cities like Genoa or Venice. Most likely it was all of these factors together, but the contrast was stark enough that contemporaries noticed. While France buried half its population, while the Holy Roman Empire collapsed into chaos, while England lost somewhere between a third and a half of its people, Poland survived, diminished, damaged, grieving, but functioning, still governed, still economically active, still intact as a kingdom. And in a continent where entire kingdoms had cracked under the weight of the dead, that was something close to extreme. The price of survival. Survival had costs. Poland still lost perhaps a quarter of its people. Entire villages fell silent, families were destroyed. The clergy died in numbers that left parishes without priests for years. Harvests failed when the people who would have brought them in were dead or too sick to work. And perhaps the heaviest cost was something less visible, the psychological weight of living through a catastrophe that had no explanation. Medieval people had no framework for understanding infectious disease. They had no concept of bacteria, of contagion in the modern sense, of the relationship between rats and fleas and human death. What they had was theology, and theology told them that suffering on this scale had to mean something. It had to be punishment. It had to be warning. It had to be the beginning of the end of the world. Polish clergy wrote of parishes where there were so many dead that proper burial was impossible, where bodies were buried in mass graves without individual ceremony, which was a profound violation of the Christian understanding of what a proper death required. The survivors carried this. The knowledge that their neighbours, their families, their priests had died without the rites that were supposed to prepare a soul for judgment. The fear that they themselves might be next. The guilt of having lived when others hadn't. Casimir organised relief efforts, distributing food, attempting to maintain order in regions where local governance had collapsed under the weight of deaths. But there was no administrative fix for what the plague had done to the human interior, to the faith of a people who had prayed and watched the prayers go unanswered over and over for 5 years. The kingdom survived. The people inside it carried the plague's shadow for a generation. What came after? The Black Death changed Poland in ways that would echo for centuries. The Jewish communities Casimir had protected became one of the most significant in the world. By the 16th century, Poland was home to the largest Jewish population in Europe, a community that would produce scholars, merchants, philosophers, and artists who shaped European civilization for centuries. The reduced population created labor shortages that, as in Western Europe, temporarily improved the conditions of surviving peasants, though Polish nobility would eventually reassert control in ways that led to serfdom becoming more entrenched in Poland than in the West. Casimir himself died in 1370, after a reign that had transformed Poland from a fragmented medieval kingdom into one of the most organized and prosperous states in Central Europe. He died without a legitimate male heir, the last of the Piast dynasty that had ruled Poland for 4 centuries, but the kingdom he had built survived him. The legal reforms, the cities he founded or fortified, the trade networks he maintained, all of it endured, and the decision he had made in 1347 to restrict movement and protect his people from a disease he didn't understand through methods he couldn't fully justify. That decision had preserved enough of his kingdom's population and economic infrastructure that Poland emerged from the Black Death stronger, relative to its neighbours, than almost any other kingdom in Europe. History gave him the name Casimir the Great. He earned it. Outro. The Black Death killed somewhere between 75 and 200 million people worldwide. In Europe alone, it reduced the total population by roughly a third, a loss so enormous that it took 200 years for Europe's population to recover to pre-plague levels. It ended dynasties. It transformed economies. It cracked the foundations of the Church's authority in ways that would eventually lead to the Reformation. It accelerated the end of feudalism. It changed everything it touched, and in one corner of Central Europe, a king who paid attention to what was coming, who restricted movement, protected the persecuted, maintained order through the chaos, managed to lose a quarter of his people instead of half, a quarter instead of half. In the mathematics of a pandemic, that was the difference between a kingdom that survived and a kingdom that didn't. Casimir the Great is not a name that most people know today, but the Jewish communities he protected survived to shape European history. The kingdom he preserved survived to become one of the great powers of Central Europe. The decisions he made in a year when half the world seemed to be dying, those decisions echoed for centuries. Sleep well. And remember, sometimes surviving isn't about being stronger than what's coming. Sometimes it's simply about paying attention before everyone else does. This has been Kingdoms After Dark.